I am going to hand this lovely mic over to a wonderful, thriving Southland cheerleader, Robin Dines, who is just up here on the stage, and she is going to facilitate this expert pasture panel. So Robin is based out of Lincoln, but she is primarily a principal scientist at Ag Research, so she is indeed an expert herself. As well as this, Robin is a FAR board member and is recently, she told me not to say anything extra about herself, but she was recently awarded the Bledisloe Medal for her leading work in multidisciplinary agriculture-focused research and adoption programness. Wow, I really should have written better, shouldn't I, Robin? But this is an award that's not given out very lightly, and it's an incredible achievement, so we wanted to acknowledge that Robin does indeed have a very big own list of achievements, and we're so grateful to have her here facilitating this expert panel. So I will hand over to Robin, where she will introduce our awesome panel. Robin.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for that warm introduction. I'm feeling very privileged to be the 2025 Bledisloe medalist, being only the 4th woman ever, and born in Southland, so all as well. This morning, our panel discussion, I'm going to be really rude and ask those of you behind the fence to shut up, please. They don't listen to me either, do they? It's quite difficult on the stage. Thanks, Tanya. So it's great to be back here today, and I'd just like to point out the merits of wool. I am wearing multiple layers of wool, including the New Zealand Sock Company wool socks, and I am cosy warm this morning. Our task for our panel on my right is grassroots to blue sky, maximising pasture and forage production. We might be the bottom of the world. We're very small. In fact, we're so small we're left off most maps. Dave Lamb and his colleagues like to think of us as just another state of Australia, but we have so many advantages. Our mild temperatures, our fertile landscape, and our 9 million hectares of pastoral land. Our year-round grazing is our natural advantage and has been for 100 years. We are good at pastoral management, but our question is, what's going to be needed in the next 50 to 100 years to maintain our advantage? It's my absolute pleasure to introduce on the far side my colleague from Ag Research at Lincoln. Sorry, David, I'm turning the page. David Wright. He leads our microbial solutions team at Ag Research, and they are, in fact, recognised globally for their fundamental and applied research on microbial production in pastoral soils and systems. David's been with us at Ag Research for many years, so brings a great deal of experience to his role, and you want to know about things like grass grub, have a chat to David at lunchtime. In the middle, most recently, a grey nomad. Sorry, Dave, I couldn't resist. Dave owns a caravan and has been touring around Australia, which definitely makes him a grey nomad. And also one of the most recent to be awarded the Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, and that's an esteemed academic award that in fact both David and John hold. David is a pastoral scientist. He was most recently at Dairy NZ, but his pedigree goes back to Australia, before that Ag Research and before that DSIR. And at this end, Dr. John Carradis, who is the Chief Technical Officer of Grasslands Technology, and he's been in that role for 2 months. Prior to that, for the previous 19 years, John was the CEO of Grasslands Technology, which is a subsidiary of Ag Research. John, in the distant past, was a clover breeder. So the three together, I'm sure you will agree, are well positioned to talk about maximising pasture and forage for the next 100 years. And I'm going to ask John to lead off. What we're going to start with is a short presentation from each of our panellists before we get into some questions. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Robin, and it's a real pleasure to be here and share with you some of the information and knowledge that we have that hopefully will be of benefit to you as farmers in terms of improving the pasture growth, particularly leading to productivity on your farm and improved profitability. So as Robin mentioned, my past life I was a white clover plant breeder, originally employed by what was then DSIR Grasslands. And during that time as a plant breeder, you just sort of take for granted that you're actually making a difference. But then the question begs you, are you really making any difference at all? And so that's where I've asked this question about pasture plant breeding. Is it really worth the bother? And does it actually make a difference? And if it doesn't, why doesn't it? And where is the issue? So those are some of the questions that I want to discuss with you today. This graph shows you it is now relatively old work, but it still holds true today. When you want to look at the genetic gain that you've achieved as a plant breeder, or as a group of plant breeders across a set of time, the easiest way to do that is to take cultivars that have been bred in various decades of time and grow them all together in the same place at the same time. And this graph here shows you the outcome of that sort of trial for white clover across a number of decades. It's not quite in focus from where I'm standing, but is that in focus from where you're standing? Good, okay, must be me. So these are cultivars that were bred right back in the 1930s. Now, interesting enough, the 1930s is when plant breeding, or forage plant breeding, really started to take off in New Zealand. It really started to begin its journey back then. So we couldn't go any further back, really, than 1930. And we've gone right up into the 1990s when this trial was run in the early 2000s. And as you can see there, over that period of time, as gone on, there has been an improvement in both the yield of white clover and the proportion of white clover that was in the ryegrass sward in which these trials were grown. So from a plant breeding perspective, you could say, well, we have been successful in terms of improving the genetics of the plant. So now we've got a plant which will grow better than the ones that were bred 40 or 50 years ago. In this particular case, the advantage was somewhere in the order of 0.6% improvement per year. So over a decade, that would be a 6% improvement in both in terms of dry weight and the percentage of clover that you'd find in your sward. So that's white clover. This table here, which I apologise for the size of it, it comes out of a review, but basically what it shows in that column second from the right is the percentage improvement per decade for a range of different forage species. And most of it sits somewhere between about 3% and 6 or 7% per decade. So over a period of time, plant breeding has been successful in terms of putting together the genes that are going to make a difference and improve the yield of a particular forage species. The question there begs, so does that get translated onto farm? And do you in fact get that benefit that we see in plant breeders' plots onto a working farm? Now, interesting enough, there have been a number of trials done trying to work out whether that in fact is the case or not. And this table here summarises the outcome of, 28 trials where they were comparing the genetics of either old or new cultivars. And we've also got a set of trials in there that looked at the impact of epicloe endophytes as well on improvements in pasture yield. And of those 28 trials, 20 of them did actually show that it was possible to carry over those benefits that we were seeing in plant breeding plots onto on-farm benefits in the right direction. As you can see, the percentage difference on that right-hand column indicates that actually sheep and beef farmers have been able to, or sheep and beef farming systems are able to do this very effectively, it appears. Unfortunately, less so when you look at dairy, and I'm not quite sure why that is, but where these trials have been placed on dairy farms for testing, it's been somewhat more difficult to show that carryover advantage that we might have expected. That then begs the question, so why would that be? Why are some on-farm evaluations failing to deliver that benefit that we're seeing in plant breeding plots through to on-farm productivity and profitability. So there are some factors that be controlled within those experimental designs that were set up to try and transfer that benefit. And I've listed some of these on this slide here. If you have a system where you're overgrazing your farmlet, you really aren't giving that plant the opportunity to express its genetic potential. So that's going to be a bit of a negative. Maybe there was a wrong choice of cultivars. I know we're all receiving advice on which are the best cultivars to put in and which aren't, but we need to identify which are the best cultivars for our particular farm. Extensive use of conserved feeds can also dumb down the impact that you will have from those improved cultivars. Some of the experimental designs that were set up lacked statistical power, and so maybe they were unable, just in the way that they were designed, to show that benefit that we were seeking. And then the use of nitrogen. Well, particularly when you're looking at the benefits of white clover, to have high levels of nitrogen on your paddock probably are going to take away any of those improved benefits that you might have seen from improved white clover cultivars. In terms of factors that are largely beyond experimental control, climatic events. So if you've got a trial that's running, or a farm that is hit severely by drought, it's quite likely that the yield differences that you would get with those improved cultivars will be significantly dumbed down. They all need water, and if that's a limitation, then it will reduce that genetic gain. There can be immense temporal variation across your farm, and in fact I've just been at the nutrient workshop which talked about putting fertiliser on when it was needed, not everywhere, and this is just typical of most farms, that there is a lot of spatial variation that you will have on those farms. And then also the way in which the plant grows and looks, that's its phenotype, can also have an impact on the benefit that you're likely to get from these genetic improvements. Also beyond our control is the way in which some of these plants have been bred. But it's within the control of the plant breeder, but not the farmer, obviously. A lot of breeding early on particularly was done in monocultures. So you had clovers growing on their own, often as space plants. They had no grass competition, and so the environment in which they were selected was a long way away from the environment in which they would have been faced when on farm. And sometimes you could add that, in fact, our plant breeding programs have focused too much on yield and not enough on quality, and that's something that needs to go back into the plant breeding community to point out that there are changes that they too need to make. There have been papers published that maybe yield is just too complex a character for us to select from a plant breeding point of view. I do struggle with that concept, but it has been put up as an issue. So look, in conclusion, we can see that plant breeders can indeed deliver improved forage and pasture cultivars. Capturing that difference on farm is really where the challenge is. And to make sure that we get that benefit, we need to have the appropriate grazing management that's aligned with feed supply and with demand. We need to choose the correct cultivars, and we need to manage those high and low moisture levels so that they don't, and it's easy to do, I guess, if we've got a farm that's irrigated for one that isn't. It's a real challenge to know how to manage those dry spells when the differences between our pasture cultivars will be reduced significantly simply because of that environmental overlay. So hopefully some of that's of use, and I'm going to hand over now to David, who's going to talk about productivity.
Okay, thanks, John and Robin. Good morning, everyone. Also, echoing John's comment, great to be here and to be able to talk to you today. As Robin said in the introduction, I've recently retired from Dairy NZ, actually about 3 years ago. I am wearing a Dairy NZ jacket, thank you, Richard, because also, as Robin said, I've just come back from a trip around Australia and it's been a lot warmer there than it is here, and I didn't want to lug all my bloody winter cold gear around Australia to bring here because I knew it would be cold. So Richard has come to my rescue. The other thing about coming back so recently from that trip in Australia is, as I was saying to John and David in the car on the way out from Invercargill Airport, and the drive from Invercargill to here this morning, I saw more green pasture than I saw in 4 weeks going around southeast Australia, southern New South Wales and Victoria. So that gladdened my heart somewhat because I'm a pasture person. My research career has been in pasture and grazing management and farm systems development. I was responsible for one of the experiments that John put up there in dairy that did not show a difference in pasture yield or milk production or profit from high producing cultivars versus lower producing cultivars. So we've had several discussions about that. We remain friends. We've worked together for many years, and the critical point out of that I would say is we need to sort this out. And if there are doubts about whether breeding is actually delivering in farm systems, we need to know why that is. Otherwise, we're going to continue doing the same thing and potentially get the same result, which is not a positive result for you. So it's and what I would say is Dairy NZ and the New Zealand Plant Breeders Research Association, which is the association of the commercial plant breeding companies in New Zealand, are working together on this. In the past, we would have stood off and thrown rocks at each other, but in more recent times, there's been a recognition that everybody really needs to be in this together. We need to work on it for the benefit of agriculture and, in fact, for New Zealand. So my first starting point in talking about pasture at an agri-tech conference is to just remind us that pastures are our competitive advantage for our sheep and beef and dairy sectors and the other livestock sectors that use pasture. And what that means is it actually enables us to tap something like 35 billion of export income per year from those sectors. Dairy plus red meat combined comes to about that. I think our Minister mentioned about 80 billion of primary sector, 50 billion, was it? I can't remember, 50 billion. I don't listen to politicians as well as I should. About 50 billion of primary sector export income per year. 35 of that is coming from pasture base. And, you know, it's been repeated time after time that pastures are the competitive advantage of those industries, so they're pretty bloody important. So if it's a $35 billion proposition, then it begs the question, well, how much should we be investing in maintaining this competitive advantage? I mean, what would you do if you were a commercial company turning over $35 billion with your R&D budget? What would you do? How much information would you have about your competitive advantage? And I did a little bit of thinking and Google searching on this, trying to think of a company that might have a similar turnover to 35 billion that has a clear competitive advantage, and I thought about Volvo cars. So what are Volvo known for? Any suggestions? Safety, exactly. So that's their competitive advantage that they built their brand on.
Dave, they're also known for cheating on their diesel efficiency too.
Yeah, well, okay, they all do that. So Volvo Cars has an annual income of about 60 billion, from what I can find out. They have a research budget that's about $3.3 billion, and they'll be spending that on a number of different things. But if we said that safety was about a third of their research budget, that's about $1 billion going into R&D on safety. Let's just call it. In New Zealand, on pastures, both the public and private sector, we're spending somewhere between 50 and 100 million. So that's about 1/10 of what a company like Volvo is doing, using some figures that are rubbery, but as an indication, about 1/10 of what Volvo is doing to sustain its competitive advantage. So we're up against it. So we've got to be pretty mean and lean in how we spend the research and development investment for the benefit of our pasture sector. So I've got 3 things that I want to cover today, just very briefly, so it needs to be brief, Robin, sorry. I'm rambling a bit here already. at an agri-tech sector like, agri-tech focused event like today, it's easy to kind of come to an event like today and think, well, there's plenty of examples where agri-tech is developed, goes out into the market and is looking for a problem to solve. Agri-tech's most valuable if there are direct problems that it will help address, and we've heard from David Lamb this morning of some examples of that, and some of the workshops are dealing with that as well. So there is a problem in New Zealand pastoral sector, and that's the second point that I want to come to. Well, actually there's two problems. My first 2 points give the agri-tech innovators some real problems to get their teeth into. The first is we have a really poor understanding of the status of our pasture resource across New Zealand. We have stuff all information on the productivity of our pastures, growth rates, yields, across sectors, across regions, the composition of our pastures, what's growing in them, how persistent are they, what inputs are going in. We have stuff all. And this is a $35 billion industries that are based on pasture as their dominant feed. This is a real problem. So if agri-tech can deliver us information about what's going on out there on farms on pasture, that would be brilliant, because we would then have a way of tracking what's going on. And if you know what's going on, then you're in a position to manage it or direct R&D investment, whatever it might be, to the cause of the problems that emerge from that information. So that's my first point. We're dealing with industries that are generating $35 billion for New Zealand, largely from pasture-based feeding, and yet we have very little information about our pasture resource. That's incredible to me. The second point I want to make is that when we started in Dairy NZ 10 years ago looking for information that would give us some trends on dairy pasture productivity, and we were able to pull some information from Dairybase. Some of you in the audience who are dairying, maybe in Dairybase, and that does give us a pool of about 1,500 to 2,000 farms. I might be a bit off on that, Richard, but from which we can calculate pasture eaten on dairy farms. And it goes back here to 1990-91, and these are the national average trends in pasture eaten on our New Zealand dairy farms from that time. I don't think the pointer is working. So you see between 1990 and 91 through to 2003, 2004, we've got very steady gains in pasture eaten, average just under 9, up to about 11. So that's growing at about 1.75% gain per year in pasture eaten. Fantastic. Then we look at what's happened since 2004-05 through to 2019-20.
What year did you come back from Australia?
I don't know what you're getting at there, Robin. I'll just move on from that. The whole thing has flattened out. So since then, we've been gaining at about 0.25% per year. Now, all of these gains in this period and in this period can be explained by nitrogen fertiliser and stocking rate, every bit of it. And even in this latter period, you know, we started using nitrogen heavily in this period, grows more grass, fantastic, put more cows on, utilise more grass. This period, we kept putting more nitrogen on, we kept putting more cows on, but we got a lesser result out of that. So that tells us that something is going on here. And you might ask me, well, what is the reason for this flattening of the trend? And I have to, if I'm utterly honest, have to tell you, we do not know. Because of my previous point, we've got no data from farms that's at enough detail and enough scale to really understand what is going on. We can hazard a guess. I would say climate change impacts may already be having an effect here. And another one I would suggest would be systems change, because from around about 2004, 2005, we started to see supplement use increase across the industry, chasing high production. And we know that every time supplement is used on farms, some of that supplement ends up with pasture wastage, the substitution effect. So you put 2 kilos of supplementary feed in front of an animal, and she will leave somewhere between 0.6 to 1.2 kilos of grass in the paddock, unless that is absolutely perfectly managed. And can we put our hands on our hearts and say supplement feeding is managed perfectly on farms every time? No, it's not realistic. So there's two things, climate change and systems change. But those are only, you know, those are hazarding what I'd hope to think was an educated guess. But what we do know, oh, hang on a sec, so it even gets, we get down to a bit more detail. We can start to look at what's going on region by region. So don't worry about trying to read the years or the upper axes. Just know that this axis is about how much crop and pasture is being eaten per hectare. This is about time, years. Look at the lines, and these are the trend lines that go through those data sets for different regions. Northland, we're seeing a decline. Waikato, we're seeing a decline. These are for the average farms, so you're putting a line more or less through the middle of all those data sets. Canterbury, it's static. Southland, Otago, pretty static. And you might say, oh, that's just a management thing, right? So average farm management could be better. Well, even if you look at the top 10% farms, then we see a similar, and I'd suggest worrying trend of either static, pasture eaten, or in case of some decline in Southland, Otago, Canterbury the only one showing a positive trend. There's some more recent information I just got this week from another source. This is for Otago Southland. This is for a more limited period, 14-15 to 23-24, and that is actually a declining trend of about 100 kilos of dry matter per hectare per year reduction. So over 10 years, that's taken out about 800 kilograms to a tonne of pasture eaten, if that trend continues. So like I said before, we don't know with certainty why, but what we do know is we can't continue on that pathway because we know where that goes. It goes to lower production, lower profit, and people starting to think about moving cows indoors and doing all sorts of things with a lot of capital, which is not going to be the right basis for our industry. The third point I want to say today is, despite this, I don't want to leave you with a glum feeling because there's things we can do about it, and that's the point about agri-tech, is agri-tech can potentially help us deal with these trends, right? So there's the problem for agri-tech innovators and for that to focus on, and there's the opportunity for farmers to use agri-tech. And I'm going to include breeding as agri-tech because it is a technology, John, and so breeding has to be part of our response to this. But as I go back and said right at the beginning, we need to understand what we're getting from breeding. So if we were getting those 1% gains a year or whatever it was, John, or even 0.5, that line should be going up. Theoretically, it should be going up, but it's not. And maybe breeding for environmental footprint is the big thing to focus on in the future. The other one about agri-tech is sensing and data. For supporting grazing and feeding decisions. So if we're using supplement, let's use it better so we reduce substitution. Getting a handle on variability, paddock to paddock, within paddock, being talked about today. Prediction, so what does the next 3 to 4 months hold in terms of projected pasture growth rates? These things are all happening in Australia with the use of data and sensing in rangelands and other arable, and the arable sector in particular. And the final point would be generating big data, enough data off enough farms to solve the original problem that I went back to right at the start, which is the lack of data that we've got now. So David Lamb's point about joining the data dots. First of all, we've got to get the data. If we can and use agri-tech more intensively across our industries, then we've got an opportunity of harvesting that data, bringing it together, and analysing national trends out of that, if we can join it up. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Robin. Sorry, I've used too much time.
Yes, my two esteemed colleagues have used quite a lot of time. Now, they've given us, David, could you make your way up, please? They've given us some pretty big challenges. You lot have been going backwards in the last 20 years. Don't let them away with that. Let's get some questions into Slido that we can challenge the leaders in the pastoral research and the leaders in the genetics, because how do we flip that line? How do we go upwards? David, microbials, please. Please stick to time.
All right. G'day, and thanks for having me as well. We've talked a lot about looking at the stuff we can see above ground in terms of pasture. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's happening below our feet. So sort of the soil microbiology is kind of the final frontier. There's so much we don't know about it. And so as we're working to unravel the way the microorganisms interact with each other, and also how they interact with plants. There are things that we do know. So we know that there are microbes underground that play important roles that support plant production and persistence. So there are organisms involved in nutrient cycling, and I'm sure you're all well aware of the rhizobia white clover interaction that fixes atmospheric nitrogen. There's a bunch of other organisms that do the same function. There are others that make phosphate available to plants, and yet others that produce plant hormones that, for example, produce better root growth that leads to increased nutrient uptake and tolerance to stresses like drought. And there's also a whole range of organisms involved in keeping pest and disease problems in check so that we don't have huge outbreaks. And I'll start there with some familiar beasties that you're probably all no doubt aware of, so I probably don't need to tell you about them. The biggest concern with these at the moment is the loss of chemical control options for grass grub. And so we're going to lose diazinon in 2028, and it may disappear earlier if there's no market for it. So it's been banned in Australia this year. Chlorpyrifos is the other compound that's currently used, and that's just come under urgent review from the EPA. So it will essentially leave us with no chemical control options for our biggest pastoral pest. But the good news is that we've been working with grasslands and midland seeds on a biological to control grass grub. So it contains a bacterium called AGR96X that kills grass grub and manuka beetle. It only kills those two. We're not aware of anything else that it kills. So it's very specific. But we've demonstrated in multiple field trials throughout the country that it has equivalence to diazinon, both in terms of the knockdown speed and the efficacy. So that was a registration package for that was submitted to ACVM at the end of last year, and we're hoping to have something available for use before we lose our chemical options. The other big issue we think that's affecting pasture persistence is the presence of soil disease. And we think this is massively underestimated. And so while we don't kind of understand it in any great detail, this is some work from AgResearch that shows that if you've got a soil with a greater microbial diversity, the soil is much more resilient to disease. So you're less likely to get a disease outbreak when you've got a wide microbial diversity. So there may be inoculants and things specifically that can help, but really just maintaining a broad diversity is generally a good thing. So what can you do to maintain microbial diversity? There are a few kind of actions that you could take on farm. And a general rule is what's good for plants is good for microbes. So things like maintaining optimal pH is really important to keep that diversity. Getting organic matter into the pasture provides food and gets those things really cranking over. And there's increasing amounts of evidence that minimum till, no-till systems really have a much higher diversity because there's not that there's so much less disturbance to those complex ecosystems and lets them stay in balance. And there's other factors that are more difficult to control. So obviously microbes don't like to be too wet or too dry, and compaction causes issue with gas transfer. And so in certain situations, you may be able to use inoculants, and I'll get to those in a minute. So I'm just going to sort of jump to the nutrient cycling part, and I'm sure you're all aware of nitrogen white clover. But this is a piece of work we did in AgResearch where we surveyed farms, both at paddock and field scale, both for the presence of rhizobia and also measuring the effectiveness of that rhizobia. And so you can see from the heat maps that there's a lot of spatial variability, and even the presence of rhizobia doesn't necessarily mean it's effective. So there's a really good case there for inoculation and maintaining inoculation.
So David, I'm going to push you along a bit.
Yep.
So does that mean that if we inoculated with the right rhizobia that AgResearch produces, we might be able to turn the whole map red?
Ideally, yeah.
Excellent,
Yeah.
thank you. Next slide, please.
Okay, next slide, righto. For those of you that were here last year, you may have remembered Alison Stewart talking about this this product from Corteva, which is a different nitrogen-fixing organism. The message last year was that it's not available in New Zealand because the organism is not recognised as present here.
And the good news is,
In the last 2 months, the EPA has recognised that this organism is present in New Zealand. So we may see some of these kind of products emerging sometime soon, and there's a lot of hype about those globally. So we'll see.
and so David, as you come to this last one, how do we isolate out and utilise microbes to our benefit? And is the research being done on this? Can you tie that in to this question? Because it sort of is the same thing, isn't it?
How do we isolate out? I'll just carry on for now. I'll think about that.
So they're asking,
Yeah,
can we isolate microbes? Well, that's what an inoculant is, right?
essentially.
So if someone
yeah.
tries to sell you an inoculant, what are the questions that you should be asking?
If someone's trying to sell an inoculant, yeah, so I guess you need to be really clear around the problem that you're trying to solve, and then think about whether the product is a credible solution. So ask yourself, for example, if you're trying to address phosphate, if you're trying to put a phosphate solubilizing organism into a field with a high S&P, you're unlikely to get a response. So you need to understand the situation you're in. And then, and then thinking about the product itself, does it have a history of success? Can the manufacturer tell you what the active ingredients are and how it works, and make recommendations on how to use it? And are you putting it into a soil that's conducive to microbial activity? Yeah. Should I stop there?
Awesome, thank you, David. Right, the first question that I've got for you, John, is can we breed a clover, please, that does not cause bloat? My second one for you.
So we actually do have a clover that produces condensed tannins in its leaves. Now, condensed tannins are renowned for binding protein in the rumen, and that stops it foaming and causing bloat. The challenge here is that these condensed tannin expressing white clovers are genetically modified. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's an interesting question, and we've got the Gene Tech bill going through the House at the moment. It's interesting that white clover produces condensed tannins in its petals anyway. And all that's happened is that a master gene switch has been taken from another clover species that grows in New Zealand, wild. It's an introduced species, grows in the high country of the South Island called Haresfoot trefoil. And in there's a gene called a transcription factor. It's a master switch that turns pathways on and off. And this one turns the condensed tannin pathway on. That master switch has been put into white clover using genetic modification, and it turns on the condensed tannin pathway in the leaves. But it's genetically modified and therefore will be regulated. Would the risk of that be seen to be too high to be released in New Zealand? Well, that's what, if the new gene regulator gets the job, will decide. At the moment, that material is being tested in Australia. We have a licence from the gene regulator in Australia, and we're testing that in containment, so it's under a bee-proof tent in a grass sward in Victoria. We have generated seed off that. We've looked at its agronomic fitness, and we're about to embark on some animal feeding trials to determine the extent of methane reduction in one instance, but we also know that those plants will reduce bloat. We have shown in laboratory testing that they don't foam and they don't produce that bloating effect at all. So it is possible, but it's genetically modified.
Thanks, John. David, just to circle back to, David Wright, the isolation of microbes and research on them. You touched on the Corteva product that will soon be in New Zealand. Is there much other research going on around extraction of microbes and research?
Ag Research has quite a program around microbial discovery and product development, and we're working with grasslands in particular to get commercial partners to develop products and get those to market.
And so those are products as soil additives. What else?
So biopesticides, by fertilisers, plant growth promoters.
So to be used to control pests, potentially as fertilisers, as plant growth?
Yep.
Yep.
Can I just add, Robin, that the biggest challenge here is not identifying an effective microbe that will do something of value on your farm. It's actually manufacturing and supplying it to you so that it's alive when you get it. New Zealand does not have a fermentation industry that can undertake this work at scale and deliver it to you in a formulated product that will be effective. We need that industry in New Zealand if we're going down this route of using microbes.
Synthetic versus organic fertilisers. Are organic fertilisers better options for soil microbes, or is a nutrient just a nutrient? Thinking.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't kind of know the answer to that, but I guess what I can say is the input of any nutrient into a system really has a significant impact on the organisms that are active at the time. So these things are living in a space where they're used to resource fluxes, so they may be sitting quite dormant. Suddenly there's a flush of nutrient and there'll be a whole burst of activity from a potentially different group of organisms than what was there before. And so that's one of the questions that we need to unravel is how does fertiliser input influence the populations of microbes and the functions that they're doing?
I've got another question for David Wright, and after that, Dave Chapman. We've been so busy on trade-offs, Dave Chapman, that our pasture system's got lost behind the animals. I'll get you to think about that. Well, David Wright, is there a cheap and easy and accurate test to get baseline microbial activity already in our soils before we try to improve them?
I guess the short answer to that is no. Well, there are tests out there, but I guess we need to have a lot more granularity to the tests that we have to really understand. There's certainly a lot of interest from industry to develop those tests, but we're kind of at a case where we need to collect the data before we can interpret it, before we can make those really good tests available.
So David, in the research we're doing, we're just getting a microbial respiration rate. It doesn't tell us anything about what microbes are there. We just know how busy they are, which I presume is equivalent to burying your undies.
Not far from it.
You know the burying your undies one, right? You bury your cotton undies and see how long they take to disappear. Is that the equivalent?
I guess what we really need to understand is the functions that they're playing and,
Exactly.
and how they switch on and off.
Not just how many are there.
Exactly.
And how many microbes are in my fingernail?
Billions.
A lot. Billions, which is the thing about trying to perturbate it, isn't it? The thing about trying to change it. Yeah. Dave Chapman.
The question was about trade-offs.
You know, are we focused on the cow and therefore pasture
Yeah.
just falls in behind?
Well, I think in the dairy industry, yes, you look back two decades plus a bit, there's been a headlong drive for production. It's the cow that produces milk, so yes, I think there's been a heavy focus on more milk. It's been driven by, successful establishment of markets overseas, so we've been able to sell that milk through the milk companies quite successfully, and they've been keen to have more milk. So it's all kind of fed on itself to increase milk production.
So nitrogen's easy.
Yeah,
more
nitrogen's
supplements
good.
Easy.
Supplements are good.
And the pastures it's not that the pastures are going backwards so much, Dave, is it?
No, I mean, they've kind of been staying static. But yeah, there's definitely a trade-off. If you want to get maximum production out of animals, particularly from pasture, then you're going to use a lot of nitrogen fertiliser, you're going to graze it pretty hard, you're going to stock it pretty high. There are trade-offs. If you want a balance between pasture and animal, there are trade-offs you would have to make. And farmers have been reluctant to make those trade-offs for the last 25 years because they involve potentially pulling back some production. And I think that's been to a detriment of pasture persistence in parts of the country, particularly the Upper North Island, where it is quite a significant problem. We've lost track of the needs of the plant and have focused too much on the needs of the animal.
And it's fine when we're in high payout times, right? But if we and the other thing though is, has John and his plant breeders simply made it too difficult? You know, because they've bred plants with bigger leaves?
Yeah.
Or is it, Dave, that we as farm system scientists
Well-
have failed to get in and understand the rules? Who are we going to pass the buck to here?
Well, I'm not going to blame the breeders. I mean, the industry has been asking for more yield,
Yeah.
and breeders have tried to breed for more yield. And the way, so here's the thing that's quite interesting for me, is the way that breeders have increased pasture yield, from what we can figure out, is they've bred plants with bigger leaves. So if you want to increase yield, you can't really change the rate of leaf appearance in a ryegrass plant. You can't really change tillering or tiller density that much, but you can change leaf size, and that results in more yield. The other thing that results in higher leaves and more yields is nitrogen. So if you put new cultivars plus nitrogen together, you get pastures that tend towards much higher individual leaves, and that means you're getting high pasture covers very quickly. Great from a nutrition point of view. You can go into pastures reasonably quickly and get another 1,500 to 2,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare out of them. But those pastures might be only at 1.5 leaf stage. So those of you who are familiar with the leaf stage concept, the idea is that ryegrass needs to be able to regrow to at least 2.5 leaves to balance its growth. Now, if you're hitting it at 1.5 to 2 leaves regularly, which is what your eye will be telling you when you're looking at pastures, that it's ready to graze, but it might only be 1.5 to 2 leaves, you are working against what the plant needs to balance root growth, to balance reserve composition, those sorts of things. So you can quickly
Dave,
get into trouble.
we need the tech flying across the paddock, sending you warning signals, warning you're compromising your plant.
Well, you could actually have a look at some tillers in the plants, and,
Oh, really?
and that would tell you something too.
Ooh! David, right, I'm going to come back to you in a moment. We've had an incredibly wet spring here to talk about, it's not only trashing the plants, but what happens when we put the soils under pressure for the microbes. I'm going to come back to you on that. John, one of the things that David and yourself in your papers that you both published late last year is that maybe climate and the climate impact on pastures has arrived a bit sooner than we thought. And I have been saying, best place in the world to be a producer in 2050. We've got all the upside of climate change. Climate has perhaps got here a bit faster when you've taken the time to look at the data, Dave. John, are we too stuck in ryegrass? Do we have to now start thinking about a future beyond ryegrass?
Well,
Dave Chapman, you're allowed to answer after him.
I mean, there's no doubt that ryegrass has been our favourite animal feed, and in large parts of New Zealand that still probably will remain to be the case. Outside of Southland, our ryegrasses need that endophyte in them to survive, without a doubt. Once your ryegrass plant is being affected by an insect pest and then is being hit by drought and then has been hit by possibly overgrazing, the poor plant's had enough, it's out of here. Southland, you've got the benefit probably of not having that pest pressure quite so much. Normally you don't have droughts, although I understand you have had some dry spells in this last year. So ryegrass still will have a place, but look, there are other species that we could consider. They will the challenge for our farming community, though, is that they will have to be managed differently from ryegrass. The thing about ryegrass is that it's pretty easy to manage, whereas if you're looking at something like tall fescue, you've got that awkward period around October, November when it's going to head, and farmers need to graze it regularly to keep those heads down and keep the quality up for summer. That's a challenge.
Thanks, John. I'm just going to stop you there because I'm getting the wind up for lunch signal. Dave Chapman, in Southland, should we just stick to ryegrass for the moment because we don't have the same pressures that others are facing?
Absolutely.
And make ryegrass more of a priority?
Compared to what? The cow or
The cow.
Or the sheep?
The cow, the sheep.
Absolutely.
Sweet. Right. We're going to come to a wrap-up comment from both of you in a minute, but first, David Wright, what are the soil microbes feeling in Southland right now because they got pretty much drowned for 2 months in spring?
Yeah, I guess microbial populations are always very transient, and so as the conditions change, the composition of the active components of the microbiota will change to become more anaerobic. But I think the majority of them will still be there, albeit kind of huddled up for the winter, as it were. And as the conditions change back, they will probably come back to a good state.
Excellent. So what he's telling me, I think, Ewan, we can take a deep breath and relax, because if we just hang out, those microbes are in hibernation waiting to do their job. The graph in Southland of 10 years pasture trends is not great. How much of that's due to management, Dave Chapman?
Well, we really don't know. There's so many things tangled up in that.
Are you being polite here?
Well, I'm sure we've got really good pasture managers in the room, so I
He
doubt
just
that anyone,
wants lunch.
I doubt that anyone here would question their pasture management skills. But there's already anything we do in life. There's always things we can find to improve what we do. So we've got to guard against complacency, because climate will push back, and you all know that we're facing regulations that are making our farming systems more complex and difficult. But it is a truism that pasture is still our most important feed, and that there are some basic things that were established in the go back 50s, 60s, 70s that still hold today despite everything else. And
Which
we
are
should
what?
Stick to the basics. Well, good control of pasture residuals, good control of pre-graze mass, monitoring and data. I can't stress that enough. It just comes through all the time. But I would also kind of make the point that as a farming sector, we need to be, I think, talking about if we have got problems, and there's more data we need. Like, we've got nothing from the sheep and beef sector to compare to the dairy, so we need some more information. But if we've got concerns about where pasture productivity is trending, then as industries, we need to talk these things up, because if we don't, then we'll just sit at the end of the pipeline of R&D funding and nothing will happen.
Yeah.
So let's get active about it.
That's your final word. John Caritas, one sentence, final word to leave us with, please, before I come to soil microbes.
I'll just reiterate, look, pasture is our competitive advantage, and we mustn't drop the ball on this, and put pressure on your industry good and on government to continue to support you through how we get better feed on our farms for feeding our animals. It's not just that pasture is the foundation for pasture agriculture, it's a foundation for New Zealand's economy. So let's not drop the ball, and the way that in which our research today is being managed and overseen, I was going to say it's a disgrace. Actually, I will say it's a disgrace.
Right.
Thank you.
Right, to you, David. Microbes saving the world? One
Yeah,
microbe at a
I
time.
think there's huge opportunities. There's just so much that we don't know. And an example of some exciting research that's happening at the moment is a program that AgResearch has just started looking at how plants and microbes can be bred together, so that we're breeding the microbiome along with the plants.
Right. These gentlemen will be here for lunch and here for the afternoon. Please grab them and challenge them. I think they've left us with a pretty big and gnarly challenge. We are at best flatlining. The upside is the power is yours to flip that line upwards, and there's such a great opportunity for tech to be an enabler in this place. So please join with me in thanking our panel.